Okay, so we are finally going to learn how to code, and we're going to start with the ICD-9. And the reason that I know some of you were frustrated, or a couple of you were frustrated, because we're going through the anatomy and doing all that stuff. And Chapter 1 and 21 was frustrating anyway. It's frustrating all the time. There's so much to learn, and what are you supposed to remember? But if you don't understand anatomy and physiology and the progression of disease, you can't use the ICD-9 codes properly. So I really want you, when you run into a disease that you don't understand, Google it, learn about it, because if you try to code symptoms with a definitive diagnosis, so let's say somebody had a myocardial infarction, so they had a heart attack, and you still tried to code the chest pain and the shortness of breath, that is incorrect. And in the real world, if you did it, it's not that big a deal, right? It'll still get paid. But on the AAPC national exam, it's a huge deal. You get it wrong. So you've got to know that if you have a definitive diagnosis, don't code symptoms. However, if they broke their leg, you don't code the pain because we know they fractured their leg. But if they have a headache because they also fell down, the headache is not related to the broken leg as far as we can tell, right? So you would still code the headache and then code the broken leg. So we'll learn all about that, and we're going to get started today. It's a lot of fun, and we're going to go slow as snails because I want you to really understand this. This gives you a real base of what you need to know to code in the real world and in your new jobs. And it also is a big part of the national exam. There's 20 questions that are dedicated just to ICD-9. And then a lot of the other questions that you have for coding like CPT and procedures include ICD-9 codes. So if you really know your ICD-9 well, you'll be able to rule out wrong answers on the other questions. So one of the things that when we went to teach the teacher a couple years ago, they said the biggest problem they have is students coming out of taking the professional medical coding curriculum and not being able to code ICD-9 well enough. And Chris Taylor looks up at that moment and says, "Not you, Lynn."
Yours are good.
Yours are good. Your students really know it. But I'm going to challenge you. We're going to learn coding to the highest level in ICD-9, not just basic coding. We're going to do a lot of worksheets that are actually challenge questions that were developed for people that have been coding for 4 or 5 years. If you can code those things, you'll be able to code anything. So get ready. Here we go. All right, so they break this into 3 chapters. So chapter 3 is the introduction to ICD-9. So the objectives we have in this chapter is to review the layout of the ICD-9 book, and I think Chris told you to start looking through that book last week and becoming familiar with it. Understand the conventions, master the code lookup process, and discuss official ICD-9 guidelines. If you don't look at the guidelines before you code something, you could very likely get the answer wrong. And I have a test question or quiz question, I believe it's in chapter 3, that you're going to take the quiz. If you don't check the guidelines for how to code that specific type of illness, you're going to get it wrong. So be aware that you need to rely on your guidelines. All right, this is just interesting information. The system of the ICD-9 coding system actually originated in the 17th century England, and it was called the London Bills of Mortality. So it collected information about the most frequent causes of death. They weren't trying to figure out or code people being sick. They were just trying to figure out how many people died of like the bubonic plague or some other illness. By 1937, this statistical study evolved into what was called then the International List of Causes of Death. And then the World Health Organization used this information to track morbidity, mortality for the purposes of making statistical assessments of international health and disease trends. That's how we're tracking Ebola right now. WHO is doing the tracking, and they're doing it all with ICD-10 codes. The United States we're about 12 years behind the rest of the world in bringing the ICD-10 on. We've been using the ICD-10 in the United States only for mortality and death, not using the ICD-9 because it wasn't robust enough. The rest of the world has been using the 10, 12 years. They're actually talking about coming out with the 11.
They are coming out with the 11 now for the other countries.
And we're just now getting the 10. Okay, so by 1977, the worldwide recognition, Lynn, don't go so fast, of the International Classification of Diseases 9th revision prompted the United States National Center for Health Statistics, the NCHS, to expand and modify this statistical study with clinical information. So that's where we get the CM, the clinical modifications. So when it comes here to the United States, to the National Center of Health Statistics, it comes as ICD-9 only, and then we add our own clinical modifications to it, which are your 4th and 5th digit codes. That's how it's expanded. And it gives us a better status on basic health care. It tells us a way to index medical records, facilitate medical case reviews, and provide ambulatory and other medical care programs. A lot of the studies that are done in order to develop grants are done based on diagnosis codes. I think we talked about that in the first couple of weeks we got together, about how if you have a swarm of an illness or disease or cancer type in an area, they look at the diagnosis codes that are being submitted for patients in that area to find out how many kids or how many adults or whatever are presenting with certain types of cancers. My daughter's mother-in-law has lung cancer, and she never smoked a day in her life, but she lives downwind from a nuclear power station and grew up there. So they're doing a study, and there's a lot of people that the same age as her that have never even had secondhand smoke around them that have different types of cancers, and lung cancer being one of them. It's just sad. The final changes resulted in the current ICD-9 CM. The Coordination and Maintenance Committee, which is co-chaired by the National Center for Health Statistics and CMS, perform the maintenance. So where do we have that, Chris?
Page 1 in your ICD-9 book.
So the real one.
The real one.
Not the Roman
The beginning of the
one.
red pages.
All right, so if there's questions on the test about the background of ICD-9, the only thing it doesn't say there is London Bills of Mortality. So you might want to just write London Bills of Mortality on that page, because that's what it was first known as in the 17th century. It was the London Bills of Mortality. So it tells you all about the Coordination and Maintenance Committee, and which is co-chaired by the National Center for Health Statistics, that add the clinical modifications. And this committee meets twice a year in a public forum. The changes are published in the Federal Register, and they become effective October 1st each year. ICD-9 has not been updated for the last couple of years, about 3 or 4 now, I think.
Yeah.
Some of the guidelines did change, but the actual codes and things have not changed, and they will not change from 2014 to 2015. Either book is still good, because October 1st, 2015, this year, we will start using the 10. But you still need to know the 9, because there are a lot of payers that will not be accepting the 10, and they're not required to accept the 10. So coders now will have to be able to use both sets of diagnosis codes. So it's really important to learn this one well, because it's the easier system.
Yes.
Once you know this well, the ICD-10 will seem easy to you as well. But if we had to teach you right now the ICD-9 and the ICD-10, I think I'd be pulling my hair out of my head.
Yeah, yeah.
Because there's quite a few differences in the guidelines. So when you read in a newspaper that H1N1 virus has resulted in X number of hospitalizations or deaths, or when you read the incidence of Alzheimer's disease is increasing in the country, where do you think they get those numbers from? That information comes from ICD-9 diagnosis codes that people have coded and coders have coded. So that's why it's so important for you to learn how to code as specifically as possible, and to always use the most specific code, because we see a lot of that in a coding contract that we have right now. Instead of using the more specific code for a type of cerebral palsy, they're just using 343.9. There are many varieties of cerebral palsy, and it's not fair to the patient or to the physicians that are treating the patient or to the studies that are being done about cerebral palsy that everybody's lumped into a 343.9. I mean, if they're hemiplegic or quadriplegic or spastic, we need to differentiate between those, which means we need to use 343.2 or 0.4 or 0.5 or whatever. We need to use the proper and most specific fourth digit to explain what this person has. And it's really doing a disservice to the patient, to all of us, because the way our health care is paid for and things that the payers will pay for is based on the information they get from diagnosis coding. So, it's really important that we code to the highest specificity. So where that information comes from about the Alzheimer's and so forth, it comes from the ICD-9 codes on the individual claims filed to the insurance companies and the government. This information is aggregated, used by the government to better understand health of its citizens. So they cooperatively share information, the insurance companies and the government, in order to determine, maybe we have, if it's, what's really interesting, if you look at kids with high bilirubin counts when they're first born, it's at a higher latitude in the United States. So kids that from Seattle to Maine are born with higher bilirubin counts than kids in Arizona. The way they found that out is by looking at ICD-9 diagnosis codes. All right, 4 groups function together to maintain the ICD-9-CM, and this is all on that page 1. And so if you get asked a question about who puts this together, who maintains it, who's in charge of it, who adds the clinical modifications, you're going to turn to this page, right? So I would tab this page in my ICD-9 book, because if they ask you anything about the background, the coordination, and maintenance of the ICD-9, this is where you're going to find the answer. So the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Medicare, the National Center for Health Statistics, and the American Health Information Management Organization and the American Hospital Association all get together to maintain the ICD-9, and they'll be doing the same thing with the ICD-10.
That information there is actually on page 2, second column, second paragraph, right? The 4 organizations to make up.
Second column, second paragraph on page 2. Okay, so as I said earlier, the transition to ICD-10, in 1999, the U.S. made the transition to ICD-10 for coding mortality. The ICD-10 will go into full use in the U.S. October 1st, 2015, and it is going to happen. They're not going to draw back on it. So medical necessity equals the ICD-9 or ICD-10 diagnosis. That was a hard question, wasn't it? What is medical necessity when you took that test? I mean, it's whatever it takes to affect a cure or a change in a problem. Diagnostic codes serve to identify and justify the medical necessity of services provided by describing the circumstances of the patient's condition. So we're going to charge for the service using a CPT or HCPCS level 2 code. But the way we get it across to the payer, why we even did it in the first place, why it was medically necessary, is we put a diagnosis code on the procedure code. So if I do a 2-view chest 71020 x-ray and I put ankle pain, what's the chance, my diagnosis code says ankle pain, what's the chance I'm going to get paid? Probably not going to happen, right, because it doesn't make any sense. So it's really important that whatever we're billing for, like the chest film, we have to have a diagnosis code that makes sense. So that's why when we put it on the bill or when we code it, we actually link it. So if they're seen in the office because they have a sore throat, the office visit code will be linked to the sore throat. But if we also did a chest x-ray because they also have normal chest sounds, we're not going to link that chest x-ray to the sore throat, are we? We're going to link that chest x-ray to the abnormal chest sounds. So we'll be using, on the real world bill, we'll be using 4 codes. And so we'll link diagnosis code number 1 to the evaluation and management office code, and we'll link diagnosis code 2 to the radiology code, the chest film. So it's important to know that what you do, everything that you provide, every service you provide for that patient for that date of service, has to have an appropriate diagnosis code that shows the medical necessity for why we provided that service. So diagnosis codes and the services provided must agree, like I just said. It has to be accurate for reimbursement, fewer claims rejections, reduced risk of audits, and sanctions or fines. So there are some things that are just not medically necessary. So if we had a rhinoplasty, which is in fact a nose job, and it's not an injury, we have no injury code or no E-code that explains how the injury occurred. Likely is when no one's going to pay for that nose job, right? But because they're afraid it's cosmetic. But once we prove that it was for an injury, the insurance company should pay it. So if we have the appropriate codes, we can get the claim paid. All right, so your job is to translate the documentation into ICD-9 codes to ensure accurate payment and accurate data. And the way I like to explain it is we're going to tell a story, and we're going to use 4 numbers, essentially, to tell it. So we have to explain using the most acute code first, the one that's the most important. So if somebody comes in with a splinter and they also come in with chest pain, the splinter doesn't take priority. I know I'm being a little silly, but you've got to think about what is the most important reason. Another good example is if somebody presents with chest pain and shortness of breath. Most of the time, people want to code the chest pain. But in reality, the fact that you can't breathe is going to kill you faster than the pain in your chest. So the shortness of breath would actually be a better code to list first, and then the chest pain. Because chest pain can be anything from costochondritis or a bruise. But if you're short of breath and you can't breathe properly, that is far more acute. So you have to really think about what is going to put this patient at the highest risk. All right, so when you're coding, this is the form that we use, the 1500 form, the diagnosis codes go on line 21. And then they will be 1, 2, 3, and 4. So then when you put your procedure codes in, you will put the linkage down there. Now, this is done usually by the computer system now. It's not, oh, excuse me, drop my mic. I'm trying to kill this thing, I swear. Now, when you're coding, it's usually in an electronic system, and you just link them, and it asks you to link which ones go with what services. But this is what the paper form looks like. All right, so on the UB04, they get a lot more blocks. So if you're coding for a facility, you have a lot more blocks to put ICD-9 diagnosis codes into. Okay, let's find these features. Where's volume 1? Trick question. Can anybody tell me where volume 1 is? You have an ICD-9 book, and you would assume... This one is tricky.
It's the symbols, definitions, that's where it starts.
No, that's, if you look at the bottom of your book, it should tell you.
669.
Page 669. Volume 1 is in the back of the darn book. Volume 2 is in the front of the book. It's your index.
Starts on page 85.
And then we have coding guidelines, which are the most important thing. And those begin on page, 2. They start talking about the guidelines in the front of your book. So volume 1 is also called the tabular. And volume 2 is called the index. So let me put that up on the screen. So volume 1 is the tabular list. Volume 2 is the alphabetic index. And you don't have volume 3, but there is a volume 3, and that's used for inpatient coding. So all we need to be concerned about is volume 1 and volume 2. So if I say to you, go to volume 1 and look this code up, and I give you the code, you would go to the back of the book in the tabular and look it up. You should be looking everything up in the index first and then going to the tabular and verifying the code. In the tabular section, in volume 1, we have chapters. So let's see, do I have an example coming up? Let's go to code 800 in the back of your book, the tabular.
Page 918.
Thank you. She's always faster than me.
You beat me sometimes.
Okay, on page 918, if you look at that in your AMA coding book, at the bottom left column, it says 17. That is your chapter. And then you have sections and categories and subcategories and subclassifications, and I'll describe that in further detail. But that is a chapter. So when you go to the guidelines in the front, you should be able to find the guidelines for that chapter and how to use those codes. And we're going to practice that as we go along. All right, so V codes are contained in the supplementary classification in Volume 1, patient not ill but encounters health services. So let's go find those V codes. And they're a little further back, and they start on page 960. That's the first. Okay, so these classifications are for people that are actually not ill, but they have an encounter for healthcare services. So maybe they need a vaccination. Patient presents for chemotherapy. They are ill, but the reason they're coming is for chemotherapy. If you look at some of those, if you look like V01, contact with or exposure to communicable disease, cholera, tuberculosis, poliomyelitis, smallpox, rubella, rabies, venereal disease, and other viral diseases. This is somebody who does not have that disease, but somebody who may have been exposed to that disease. So we're going to run some tests based on the fact that they were exposed. So these are factors, healthcare factors that influence the patient's health status. So maybe they have a personal history of a malignant tumor, or they have a personal history of an organ transplant, or they just had a baby. So if you look at V27, it's outcome of delivery. So this would be on mom's chart. So we would code the delivery and that the baby was born. At the very last code that we would add to it, if it was a single live born baby, we would add V27.0. If it was stillborn, we would add V27.1. If it's twins, both live born, V27.2. So we have to find the most specific code to describe what was the outcome after this delivery. Then we have E codes. These are the fun ones. This is the supplementary classification of external causes of injury and poisoning. So if you, these explain how someone hurt themselves. And when there is an injury, the insurance company really expects to know how it happened. If you injure yourself, like when I was going to have surgery on my knee, they coded it as a problem, why can't I think of it, with my anterior cruciate and a couple other cruciates. And the insurance company, because there were no E codes, because it was an old injury, not a new injury, sent out a form to me asking me how I injured myself. They weren't going to pay that claim until I filled it out. If it had been a new injury, if somebody had coded the E codes with it, I may not have received that form. So it's really important, if we know the circumstances for the injury, we need to code it. So where do we find, the V codes are in your regular index, but the E codes have their own index. And Chris is ready? You're not ready. She's going to get ready.
They might know it. They should know this.
Do you know, where's the E code index?
What page it's on? Which one is it? 645.
think it's right after the table
Yep.
of drugs and chemicals.
645. Good job.
So if you're looking for an E-code, you're not going to go looking in the regular index. You're going to go looking in the E-code index. And if you ever can't sleep at night, this is a really interesting index. You can have hit on the head by a piece of spaceship falling out of the sky. You have E-codes for meteorites and things go wrong. Unfortunately, we have a lot of new war E-codes, injured in battle. But there was one guy, I forget, he was hit on the head by a toilet seat that had been discarded from the space station.
Oh, my
That's
gosh.
a true story.
That's crazy.
There's no E-code for the toilet seat, but there is an E-code. There is an E-code for being hit by space debris. So it's kind of an interesting index.
It is a fun index to read.
One thing I want to mention now, because I'm going to say it probably 25 times over the next 3 weeks. When we code the injury, we have to also code place of occurrence. So if you look at accident, do you know where it's at, Chris?
Occurring at, so it's on page 647, middle column, where it starts off with not elsewhere classifiable involving, go all the way down to where it says occurring at or in.
And you wonder why that's important. Well, if you fell and slipped at home in your own house, your health insurance would cover you, right? But if you fell and slipped at a grocery store or something like that, and you slipped on like a wet floor, your insurance company may decide, well, somebody else may have deeper pockets.
Yep.
Maybe it should be, the grocery store's insurance company that's covering you because you were injured in their store. So we need to tell them where the accident actually occurred. So if it was like an institution, a jail, say you got hurt at the jail, a mine, motel, office building, orphanage. What's really frustrating about this index is there's a lot of specificity in the index, but when you get back to the code,
Yeah.
it's not specific at all. But you still have to use it anyway. All right, so there's alphabetic. Main terms are in bold. Some subterms are indented, 2 to the right under the main term. So they're not just in bold in this book. In our book, the main terms are in red. So accident would be a main term, and then aircraft under accident would be a subterm. Some words in the index are not in the tabular. This saves space. Yeah, and frustrates the heck out of you. That is why you must locate the term in the index first, then locate it in the tabular. On the national exam, you're not going to be looking up codes in the index. They give you 4 answers. You look at those codes and you look them up in the back of the book and you see which one makes sense, right? If it doesn't say anything close to what you think it should say, then you have to actually put your coder's hat on, go to the index, look it up, and say, well, that's where it takes me. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not as specific, but the index sent me there, so that must be the right answer. If you look up all the codes while you're taking the national exam, you will need an extra 10 hours because you can't code it. You have to learn how to rule out wrong answers. You have to use your coding knowledge, but you have to have that coding knowledge to rule out wrong answers. Okay, so if we look at under collision, this is the main term in the E-code index. Collision is the main term, and then motor vehicle is a subterm. And then you have further indentations, motor vehicle and streetcar, motor vehicle and traffic signal, sign or marker, motor vehicle and tree. So it's really important to keep looking down the whole list to get the most specific code you can find. It doesn't always take you to every digit. This is only part of the code. So let's just, for the heck of it, try this. Patient fell skateboarding. What would the code be? Everybody find it in the index? So you look under fall, then you end up on page 656, down 3/4 or a little over half the way down, and you find the word skateboard, and it tells you to go see E885.2. So let's go look at E885.2 in the tabular, because once you look something up in the index, you are required to go and look it up in the tabular. God, I'm slow.
We're on page 1007.
Thank you. So you notice up at the top there on that page, there's E885, and you see the red dot next to it? That means you can't use E885 by itself. You have to find another digit. So if you look at E885.2, it does specifically say fall from skateboard. We have fall from roller skates, we have fall from, which includes inlines and wheelies, fall from skis, fall from snowboard, fall from other slipping, tripping, or stumbling, fall on a moving sidewalk. I told you this is an interesting, it's a very interesting set of codes. So anything that happens to somebody, it needs to be documented properly and then coded properly. All right, in volume 1, which is the tabular, the format, and they're using Chapter 10 as an example. Chapter 10, diseases of the genitourinary system, and it might be better to just look at your book. So it's going to start with code 580.
Page 830.
Okay, so Chapter 10, we have the chapter. Then we have the section, which is nephritis, nephrotic syndrome, and nephrosis. Then we have the first 3-digit main category code, which is 580. Then below that, we have 4th-digit codes, 580.0, 580.4. And those are subcategory codes. And then we have, when it includes a 5th digit, so it further classifies that subcategory, it becomes a subclassification. This is kind of confusing because if you don't have 5th digits, sometimes interchangeably, when you add a 4th digit, people talk about it as a subclassification of the main category. So a subcategory is when there's 4 digits typically, and when there's 5 digits, subclassification. So is there someplace in the book that tells us about how they organize this? I don't remember. I think it's gone.
I don't remember seeing it in here, but I'll look.
Well, I'll go on while Chris is researching. All right, so your basic 3-digit category code, and the example I have here is 730, so let's go turn to that.
What pages?
877, got it, thanks. So that's your main 3-digit category code. It's really important, you guys, that you look at everything that's listed below that code. It tells you what it excludes, what it includes. It tells you whether or not you need to use an additional code. The other thing I want to point out to you real quickly while you're there, you're coding osteomyelitis, but what if you don't know what the heck osteomyelitis is? They put this little cool definition in there above it. So in blue ink, say you were taking a test, and the test question, what is osteomyelitis? And you think, okay, itis, bone, what is it? And you might be able to tough it out and figure it out. But if you go and look it up in ICD 9, there's a good shot that there will be a definition there. So use this book as if it's a medical dictionary when you're coding or answering questions about medical terminology or anatomy. Just the ICD-9 book is a great resource, and very often you will find something in blue ink that tells you all about osteomyelitis and what it is when it's acute, what it is when it's chronic, so it's really good information to know. So I want you to start thinking about using your ICD-9 book as a medical dictionary. All right, then the subcategory under osteomyelitis would be 730.0, acute osteomyelitis, and 730.1, chronic osteomyelitis. And then your subclassification. So if you look at 730, it's got a red dot. If you look at 730.0, it has a red dot, which means you can't use that code without using an additional digit. So where do we get that additional fifth digit? Look up at the periwinkle box above 730.0, and that's where you'll find that fifth digit that you need. So if I said it was acute osteomyelitis of the upper arm, the code would then be 730.02. Sometimes, like when we looked at that other code, the subclassifications will be right under the code itself. But if there's a lot of them, in order to make it easier to list it, they'll just put it in that little periwinkle box, and you have to go up to that box to find the fifth digit. When you take a test, it's the same as if you were coding. So if you give me a code, like if I asked you to code acute osteomyelitis of the forearm, and you only gave me 730.0, the whole question is wrong. Because if you submitted 730.0 to the payer, they're going to reject that claim because they want that necessary fifth digit. So that's why in my class, you don't get partial credit. If you give me 730.0, too bad, so sad, you got it wrong. You've got to give me every possible specific digit that you can. All right, specificity in ICD-9 codes, we have the 3-digit, and then we can add a 4th digit, but to be totally specific, we need to have all 5 available digits, would be acute osteomyelitis of the shoulder using 1 as our 5th digit. All right, so remember, you have to assign to the highest level possible based on the documentation. What if we don't know where it is? And it happens, you guys. Osteomyelitis is all they'll write down, and they don't tell you where. Now what do? Well, you code 730.00, unspecified site. So what if they don't even tell us what type of osteomyelitis it is? If they don't tell you if it's chronic or acute or what it is, then you have to code 730.20. The likelihood is, and if you see that little purple box, it's warning you that this is too unspecified and you're probably not going to get paid. So it's really important to look at that little purple box next to that code to warn you that if you can find something more specific, you better use it. So if a 4-digit code exists, you can't report just 3 digits. If a 5-digit code exists, you can't report just 4 digits. If you have the availability of 4th and 5th digits, you have to code to the highest level of specificity.
I did find a little something, and it's about the level of detail in coding, talking about what she was just talking about, on page 6 of your guidelines in the ICD-9. Second column, number 3, talks about the category and the subcategories and subclassifications. Number 3 down at the very bottom is where it starts, and then it goes on to the next page.
Well, that's another good thing. In case you have a question about subclassifications and classifications and subcategories, at least you can look there and read something about it. All right, so there are 5 appendices in the official ICD-9 book. Private publishers may have more, may have less. Where is Appendix A? Appendices are normally in the back of the book.
what page was it? 1027.
1027. Yes, A. All right, so we have the morphology of neoplasms. You're not going to be using this in this class. You don't need to give me the morphology code if you're coding a neoplasm. But, however, the AAPC requires that you know about this appendices or appendix. You need to know it exists, and if you want to know what it is, it tells you right there in the first paragraph what this is for. And what it does is the morphology is the science of the form and structure of an organism. It's used in conjunction with the codes from Chapter 2 neoplasms. And in patient settings, cancer registries and claim forms, they use this morphology because they're tracking the stage of a cancer and how the cancer reacts. It's not placed on the billing claim form. We don't use M codes. But you need to know that it exists, and you need to know how to find it. So the codes begin with M, followed by 5 digits. So M8400/0, sweat gland adenoma. The first 4 digits is the histological type of the neoplasm. The 5th digit is the behavior. It's benign. Example of behaviors are benign, malignant, carcinoma, and situ. In situ means carcinoma has not spread or metastasized. Carcinomas in situ are encapsulated. They don't reach out beyond where they are. So if you were diagnosed with a cancer and they told you it was in situ, that's the best possible notice or information because it's not likely to spread. It's stuck in its own little spot and it's not going anywhere. All right, Appendix B was deleted. It was the glossary of mental disorders. I really miss it. They ended up putting it in the DSM-4 for psychiatrists to use. It was a great appendix because it gave you information about like schizophrenia and all kinds of things, and it helped you to further classify and give you more information about it. One thing you do need to know, however, is about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-4. We're not going to use it, but psychiatrists and psychiatric hospitals use the DSM-4 diagnosis codes. And it could end up as a question on the national exam. If they ask you where psychiatrists get their more specific codes, they get it from the DSM-4. Then we have Appendix C. Oops. And this is the American Hospital Formulary Services. AHFS publishes a list of all the drugs, and it tells you that right there. So if they had a question about Appendix C and where this list of drugs comes from, it's in the first paragraph on that page. It tracks drugs nationally used by pharmacists, each drug coded with up to 5-digit code. This appendix is used primarily by pharmacists to track drugs nationally. We're not going to use them, but you need to know where they live and where they come from. Appendix D is industrial accidents. 3-digit codes that identify occupational hazards not placed on the insurance or billing claim, used by state and federal organizations such as OSHA. Statisticians use these codes for data to analyze the risks involved in various occupations. So labor and industries, workman's comp, they would be using these codes. They'd be assigning these codes to different accidents.
That's how they find out what they're going to charge you
Yeah.
for your workman's comp insurance.
We've been getting a refund. They charge us a lot, and then we fill out this report that says we didn't have anything go wrong and what the nature of our business is, and at the end of the year we pay more for insurance, and then at the end of the year we usually get a check back because there's been no claims and we're not high risk. long as Chris wears her glasses and she knows where she's going.
I don't trip and fall over a cord or something.
Okay, Appendix E contains a list of all 3-digit category codes. It's not something you really need to use. The categories are labeled 1 through 17 for the chapters. But anybody who's building a computer database with the codes, they would use this to come up with all the main categories and know that they have to list all the other codes under it. All right, let's do this. Let's take a short break, and then we'll come back to Volume 2.